So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Caitlin Williams, who is a PhD student in the School of History at Queen Mary at University of London. And we are very delighted to be able to hear her talk about the research she's doing toward her PhD dissertation, which she hopes to have finished in around a year's time. And we hope that she will too. So thank you very much, Caitlin.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Please do shout if anything goes wrong. And yes. Thank you all for coming in that kind introduction. So Christopher Dyer suggested that almost all households in the countryside and many town dwellers enjoyed the fruits of at least a small patch of land that could be cultivated as a garden. It is impossible to overstate the importance of the plants and herbs that were cultivated in these gardens to medieval medicine. Historians have asserted the centrality of herbal remedies to cure and well-being, as Jerry Stannard put it, from royalty and the aristocracy through the burgher classes down to the nameless rustic. Plants or plant products were the first line of defense against illness and disease. Any woman in charge of a household had to be able to identify plants and their properties for cooking, the production of medicine, and for fragrance and preservation. My thesis considers the day-to-day activities that English gentry women undertook to keep their households healthy and cure them in sickness. For the purpose of my project, I have defined the late medieval period as around 1350 to 1550. And that is the bounds of this paper tonight. And I consider gentry to be any family who gains an income from the land of a minimum of £5 per annum that belongs to a set social class which strives towards an upward mobility and improvement of social status, emulating the nobility and aristocracy as far as their means could allow. But most importantly, while they own land, they do not necessarily have to farm it all themselves and rent and live on the rent that they acquire. My work focuses on the concept of domestic medicine, which is the idea that women were producing medicine in their own homes, not for any economic benefit, but to provide for the health and well-being of their families. Of course, the major premise of this then is that the ingredients in the remedies should be accessible for at least that lower gentry family on the £5 per annum income. And thus, it should be also significantly cheaper than calling on a university-trained physician or purchasing medicines pre-made from an apothecary. We should note then that in one setting, John Paston of the Paston family, managed to run up a bill for £5 visiting a physician in just one instance. So from this, we can see how herbal remedies would be so important to those in the lower end of the gentry status. And as such, within the remedies themselves, we expect plants that could be easily cultivated in Britain to make up the large proportion of the ingredients. And I hope to show this as we continue to move through the paper. This paper in turn will discuss women's role in gardening tips in late medieval Middle English manuscripts, before moving on to consider how we can use word frequency analysis of ingredients in medical recipes from manuscripts.
Have a lovely long weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday. Don't forget your key to get into the office on Tuesday morning. It is. Yeah, I'm going to need it's my.
Consider word frequency analysis of ingredients in medicinal recipes and how we can compare this to archaeobotanical reports as a way of understanding how practical and accessible using these remedies would be to a gentry family. Harold Rawcliffe has argued that the garden constituted a major weapon in the relentless battle against disease. But what do we actually know of what people grew in their gardens? Karen Dempsey has used feminist archaeological theory to examine elite women's role in maintaining gardens in castles and manor houses, and she argues that the gardens would have held herbs and produced smells that were central to ideas of medieval ideas of well-being, so producing sweet scents to counteract any negative or foul odours in accordance to miasma theory. Dempsey also suggests that gardening mirrored women's social roles as nurturers and caregivers, and that sowing the literal seeds and nurturing plants was understood to have a sympathetic effect on fertility. However, it is both hard to identify specific garden spaces and to connect known garden spaces with a specific gender and purpose without written sources. We can see some rare examples on the slide in the screen. For example, the Hospital of St. Giles in Norwich, which was founded in 1247, where the sisters had a walled abbey in which they grew herbs for their use in medicine. And likewise, the Benedictine Abbey of Wherwell also had a garden space after Euphemia, the abbess, who died in 1257, embarked on a campaign to improve the health of her sisters, and had gardens planted to sweeten the air and remove noxious matters. So once again, working in line with miasma's theory. Similarly, the lay sisters at St. Mary's Spitalfields, who were responsible for providing the bulk of the care of the hospital's patients, tended a private garden in which they grew herbs to aid them. Even being in the garden for these individuals was considered beneficial for health, as the pleasant sights and scents promoted physical and mental stability. However, these were elite groups of women who enjoyed spaces where they could grow all that was needed to undertake their medical duties. These women religious inhabited clearly defined roles in society that surrounded their gardening activities and were at the core of it. Their experiences would have been vastly different from a laywoman. And the rest of this paper shall be devoted to how we can understand lay gardening practices. Barbara Hannawalt suggested that the small gardens cultivated by peasant families would have had cabbages, leeks, onions, garlic, peas, and beans, as well as a variety of herbs to flavour food and cure ills. Which seems very typical. We have plants that could be used as both food and medicine grown as one. It makes sense if you've only got a small space. Hannawalt's use of coroner roll suggests, regardless of what was actually grown in the garden, women managed the space. 37% of cases involving women's accidental deaths occurred in the domestic area, the home and the garden, compared to 4% of men. Furthermore, she continues to suggest that beyond their garden space, women and children and maidservants contributed to the household economy by picking greens by the waterways and nuts and wild fruits and berries in the woods. The plants they gathered did not just provide additional foodstuff, but could also be used to produce medicine. And we see this role reiterated in the poem, The Serving Maid's Holiday. The poem survives in a 15th century manuscript that contains primarily grammatical information, as well as some Middle English carols and lyrics. While the poem is rather raunchy, throughout the maid expresses her joy that it is a holiday and she can meet with her lover, and that she can break with her normal routines of domestic service. One of the jobs she doesn't have to do on the holiday is to fetch Wharton in. Wharton in this context refers to plants and herbs. The maid is responsible for gathering the required plants and herbs for the household use. Whether this is from the garden or further afield, as Wharton can refer to both cultivated and uncultivated plants, is unclear. However, we can see how gathering plants and herbs was considered the job of the domestic servant, and in families that could not afford an extensive retinue of servants, the wives and daughters. And here we can return to the idea of a gentry household, which at the lower end of the scale might only have 2 additional members of the household with them working. Of course, the further up the social scale you go, the more servants you might have, and the role of the women changes. And this we can begin to see here. if the female domestic servants and women householders of the lower classes were responsible for gathering herbs and plants, what about our elite gentry? Women. Le Ménagier de Paris, a late 14th century French conduct text, offers some suggestions. The narrator, an aging Parisian bourgeoisie, addresses his 15-year-old wife. His aim is to provide her with the moral and practical skills she will need to be a good wife to her next husband. As such, the text contains a wealth of information about the daily business of running a bourgeoisie household in late medieval France, including everything from moral instructions to planning dinner parties, to purchasing goods for the household, and even some pest control. It is not surprising then that gardening forms part of the wife's activities. The text devotes the second article of the second part to discussing gardening. And this article comprises of some 46 instructions and tips to educate the young wife on the art of gardening, from the appropriate times to plant the seeds to how to prune and how to plant and graft trees. Unfortunately, the folio slide is just the first page of the manuscript, as the pretty illustrations do not survive throughout. And it's much more interesting to look at than just a page of text. It's unclear how much the wife was expected to undertake of the gardening section on her own. Throughout, the second person pronoun is used. For example, notta that you need to sow vegetables from April to St. Mary Magdalene's Day, the 22nd of July, which does imply the reader will be carrying out this activity herself. However, this remains in the more manual and complex tasks. For example, when grafting 10 or 12 trees onto the trunk or stump of an oak tree, the use of the second person continues. Sharpen your grafts into a point on the one side, then stick your grafts into the bark of the oak. The matter of intended audience becomes a little bit more complex. While the second person is used, it is hard to imagine, and I would not like to suggest, that a relatively well-to-do woman would be undertaking the physical labour of grafting fruit trees in the 14th and 15th century. Yet it does seem that she was supposed to read it. In sections that the wife was not supposed to read, such as those concerning the purchase and maintenance of horses, the husband makes it explicitly clear. In this instance, he states, "Now at this moment I want you to rest or be merry, and I will address you no more while you amuse yourself elsewhere." And the instruction shifts to Master Jehan. However, in the section on gardening, there is no such indication. So we can assume that it was meant for the female householder to read. Teresa MacLean suggests that while urban wives would have had servants to do the manual work, she would have been expected to oversee it and provide instructions. Hence how we can see this chapter in Le Ménagier becomes useful to the wife. While the section on hiring servants makes no mention of gardeners, and perhaps we might consider they would fall into the category of those who was hired for short term to do specific work, we could understand then that these short-term labourers could be brought in accordance with MacLean's suggestion, and the wife would have read the sections on gardening in order to provide instruction to those working for her and oversee their completion of the task. And this seems more plausible when we consider the physical work involved in clearing land and removing or planting trees and tree stumps. However, in other cases, such as planting and gathering, we might see how the wife might more easily maintain the garden herself with help of some female servants. And if we work more broadly, this also fits with Michael Brewer's suggestion of the cookery sections that are also in Le Ménagier de Paris, that they were expected to form part of the performative authority of the wife. While the recipes were well suited, the cooking ones, to a gentry household, the wife would not cook them herself, but she had the knowledge to effectively oversee and manage her household. And it is likely that the gardening sections were something that she could read, and especially those involving physical work, She could then instruct somebody else to do it for her and check on their work. The allegorical nature of women's role in maintaining gardens provides a further context to their activities. In medieval literature, the garden evoked images from chastity to procreation, a space which drew parallels from the female body. And the female body then became linked to literary gardens, and enclosed an exclusive representing the Virgin Mary, pure and intact on earth. The plants within the garden required nurture, embodying the other expected role of women as mothers and caretakers. And these themes have been noted across literature from the medieval period, including the Old Testament Song of Songs. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. Here the enclosed garden is being identified as a strictly feminine space. Roberta Gilchrist further suggests that the garden was also seen to mirror the womb. An enclosed garden was a space that could be guarded, just as medieval women guarded their chastity. And this association of garden and womb echoes in the second section of the verse of the Song of Songs, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. In accordance with humoral theory, the womb was a phlegmatic, so cold and wet space, in the same way that a sealed spring and fountain was. Garden then can be considered both literally and allegorically a female space around the home. Given how central gardening was to the medieval female experience and to the productions of medicines, gardening tips sometimes appear among the medicinal remedies in the manuscripts intended for domestic use that I explore across my wider thesis. Cambridge University Library IIVI 33 is one example. This is a late 15th century manuscript containing primarily one of two known versions of the Book of Rota, a gynecological treatise, and a version of the Knowing of Women's Kind in Childing. Both Middle English gynecological treatises were bound together at a later date, no earlier than the 17th century, and likely because they had similar subject matter. The Book of Rota was also circulating independently with a section of household and medicinal recipes that are separate from the gynecological text that still remain bound with it today, although the order has been slightly disrupted. The recipe section at the end of the Book of Rota provides detailed instructions on how best to grow parsley quickly. The reader is advised to mix sweet wine that is dried with earth prior to sowing the parsley. Then it should be watered and left near the fire, and within an hour, they should have the parsley. I haven't tried it. I have notoriously bad gardening skills, but I highly doubt one would get parsley that quickly. Parsley itself, however, was commonly used in medicines. Considered warm and dry, it was recommended to those who were suffering from cold and moist ailments, such as your common cold, and was believed to provoke bodily excretion and menstruation. So you can see in this circumstance how you might want to make it grow rather quickly in a time of need. British Library Harley manuscript 2389 also contains a number of methods related to gardening. Most are associated with grafting cuttings of one fruit tree to another fruit tree to produce either some sort of hybrid fruit or extend the growing season. Harley 2389 is also a 15th century composite manuscript containing a variety of household and medicinal recipes, anything from how to remove stains from assorted cloths to how to cure toothache or itching, as well as some practical protection charms to prevent thieves from stealing washing off of a washing line, for example. When discussing gardening, a key feature is how to extend the growing season. The methods aim to keep trees in the fruit period until All-Hallowtide, so Halloween. Alongside this, there are also 3 methods to preserve the fruits and herbs as they're growing, to keep them from eating of flies, as the author scribe says. And this often involves co-planting or soaking the seeds in water that parsley or sengreen has also been soaked in. Beyond these methods of garden pest control, we can also see some general gardening tips in the Harley manuscript. For example, it is good to graft 3 or 4 days before the change of the month, and to plant all manner of plants and set them in the first day of the change of the month, the second or the third. The manuscript even provides the reader with instructions on how to have fruits that are half pear and half apple, through grafting apple and pear trees onto another non-fruit-bearing tree. The inclusion of methods to graft trees and extend growing seasons and produce hybrid fruit across this manuscript, which contains primarily medical recipes, is not unsurprising. Gardening was a domestic job whose tasks were familiar by many, as the first section showed. How and when to plant, water, and harvest your common foodstuffs and herbs would be common knowledge. And this is particularly true for households in rural agrarian areas who were involved in growing every day. Grafting fruit trees and producing hybrid fruit, however, was not everyday knowledge and more the domain of a specialist gardener. For a gentry family who sought to imitate noble households through their foodways, hybrid fruit trees and access to out-of-season fruits by extending the growing period so they were able to procure them slightly cheaper than purchasing was a matter of status. These families may not have had the means to hire a specialist gardener who would come with this knowledge, but they could instruct their existing domestic servants with the help of the book. These two manuscripts confirm the expectation that the reader was expected to be well versed in herbal knowledge. And given the extent of gardening knowledge women needed to possess, information about finding and identifying the plants required to create any of the recipes is unusual, bar a few exceptions. In the Book of Rotter, one is to find the root they refer to as kush herbalism, which is required to staunch the flux, so to stop menstruation. The specific instructions in the manuscript to provide kush herbalism state, it is in a manner of a large and long root, and it is as great as a man's finger, or else greater, and it lies in fallow lands most commonly, and it is so strong and so tough that it makes a plough to stand still. Kush herbalism doesn't appear in any medieval herbal or recipe collection that I have looked at. It seems likely to be a colloquial name for some sort of bramble plant, which explains why specific instructions might be needed to find it, as the reader, or indeed the servant she is instructing, may not be familiar with the colloquial names of plants, particularly as gentry families would travel between their larger estates. However, if anybody has come across kush herbalism or has any other suggestions of what it could be, I would be very grateful. Similarly, in British Library Sloane manuscript 72, a composite manuscript from the 15th century, there are instructions to provide codwort, stating that it grows in a valley. Codwort is used in a remedy, a salve made in Egyptian, good for to fell any wound or out of vessel. It should be noted that just because the title says it was made by an Egyptian doesn't mean it was. It's more likely that the phrase has been included to add some weight and authority that the recipe would work, rather than reflecting any Egyptian origin. The OED suggests that codwort refers to a plant belonging in the aster family, and the manuscript gives instructions that one could find it in a valley. While the cultural norms attached to gardening and instructions on how to grow various plants are useful, and find them, understanding what medieval people actually grew in their gardens remains a challenge. Beyond the elite where garden plans survive, it is hard to tell what was grown, apart from the general expectation that Barbara Hannibal suggested, as I mentioned in the introductory section, those additional foodstuffs, onions, cabbages, and additional herbs to both flavour food and produce medicine. But specific evidence of what was grown is limited. The question of access of herbs also becomes more complicated when you consider urban areas, where there would be less space to grow plants. And so this might make the production of remedies in these places more complicated too. The pie chart that you should hopefully be able to see on the slide shows word frequency analysis of the 6 primary manuscripts of my study, and you can see the titles listed below. Over the course of looking through the manuscripts, I compiled a list of all of the ingredients that were used in the manuscript, in each manuscript, and the frequency with which they occurred in the remedies. From here, I broke them down into further refined categories. For example, your native British plants, which are represented by the blue section, including things that were by the medieval period naturalised in Britain and growing readily. Your readily available raw materials, so things that would be laying around the household and byproducts of domestic life, ashes, dust, and urine would all go into your medicine in the medieval world. Animal byproducts represented in the grey, so things like animal fats, milk, eggs, as well as any parts of the animal that you might need to produce the recipe. Distilled waters and oils in the yellow, so things like olive oil, as well as the more commonly associated rose water, and so on. A small amount of imported goods were mentioned, and these include spices and herbs such as ginger, frankincense, and myrrh, as well as the liquid bases in the green that you would need to actually be able to swallow these compendiums of powder, which most frequently was ale, but occasionally wine and water were also called upon. And for the final category, which is represented by a tiny sliver, as there's not many of them, are those precious stones and objects. So things like amber and coral, and interestingly, there is one mention of unicorn's horn. As you can see from the pie chart, the largest section is that of the native plants at 39%, showing the importance of plants in gardening to medicine. The pie chart also, as a whole, also helps to allow us to understand these manuscripts in a domestic context. Over 80% of the ingredients would be readily available to perhaps even a peasant household if we consider native plants, our raw materials, animal byproducts, and liquid bases. Across the manuscripts themselves, fennel, rue, sages, mallows, roses, and betony occur most frequently. And all of these were readily cultivated in England at the time. While rue was native to southern Europe, it's grown in England since the Roman period. Sage was native to England and was so commonly cultivated in gardens that by the 17th century, Nicholas Culpeper notes that our ordinary garden sage needs no description. Similarly, his entry for fennel and mallows give very same reasons for why he was not describing them. One begins to think that he'd got simply fed up of describing plants. Roses became more common in Europe and increased rapidly in popularity as an ornamental flower after encounters in the Middle East due to the Crusades reshaped Christian attitudes. And betony is also a native British plant that commonly grew wild in the hedgerows. We can then compare the frequency of plants in the manuscripts to the frequency that they occur in archaeobotanical reports to help give an understanding of whether these plants were actually grown in the gardens and whether these recipes would be accessible to our Gentry family. To do this, I focused primarily on 19 reports, and you should be able to see references to them on the slide. I selected these reports as they all come with a relatively large sample from various locations in the UK, at different levels of urbanisation and different social classes. However, I should mention that using archaeobotanical reports is not without issue. The boundary between foodstuff and medicine was blurred, and there are potential difficulties dating archaeobotanical remains, which remains reliant on contextual evidence from other finds in any given strata in many cases. And the annual plants are also often underrepresented, particularly if they were picked before they could go to seed, and thus they don't leave much of a remain. It is also impossible to tell whether something was purposely planted in an area or if it spontaneously grew as happy accident. However, this is less of a problem for my research, as the fact it was there meant it was accessible, regardless of whether the homeowner had made the decision to put it there in the first place. In each of the reports, common plants such as cereal crops, fruit and vegetables appear most frequently, as one would expect. And many of the plants that are required for the medical recipes in the manuscripts are also identified in botanical remains at one or more of the sites. 4 of the plants that I mentioned on the previous slide as occurring most commonly in the manuscripts all appear in our archaeobotanical reports. 32 deposits of fennel. Rue was found at 1 site, roses 53 times across 7 sites, and mallows 19 times across 10. Betony and sage were not identified at any of the dig sites in the sample. And this could be a quirk of the sample sites and the survival of plant remains, so it doesn't necessarily mean they weren't there. And it could also be due to the nature of the plant. Betony, while a common medicinal herb, was never considered a foodstuff, and it readily grew in hedgerows and was available to people even if they didn't cultivate it specifically in their gardens. Betony was also believed to have other properties, including the ability to ward off ghosts and goblins and spirits. Once again, I can't attest to its effectiveness, and was often planted in and around churchyards for this reason. So it's possible if you didn't have any betony growing in your hedgerow, one could seek it at a local churchyard if you were that desperate. The lack of sage is more unusual, as it's well documented as both a culinary and medicinal plant in the period. It is possible that it may have been used completely before went to seed, and thus seed remains were not left to be identified. And it might also be that the deposits did not survive an identifiable form, or may have only been able to be identified to the genus of a plant. Plants from the Salvia genus, which sage belongs to, are identified across all of the dig sites. However, the taxonomic classes are not. So it's possible that one of these could be sage, but because we do not know for certain, I cannot make that conclusion. There are 190 different common native British plants mentioned in the medical recipes I've looked at across the manuscript. Of this 190, 49 are not found at any of the dig sites. And these identifiable plants tend to fall into one of 5 categories. There are plants whose medieval name cannot be linked to a modern equivalent, and thus we can't see or if it grew there. And these include things such as Kush herbaries, the very distinct yellow flower, which could be any number of plants, and Regina patri. There's a second group of plants that are mentioned in the manuscript via genus name only, so specific species cannot be identified in the archaeobotanical reports, and these include 15 plants such as fern, brambles, and various mints. A third category of those plants are those that grew in England but required a little bit more specialist care or conditions, such as saffron and rosemary. And then there were those plants that grew prolifically in the wild but were not used extensively for cooking and remained very much purely medicinal, like betony, but also dandelions, hart's tongue, and maidenhair. Dandelions in particular, like today, were readily available in the countryside. And finally, there is the category of annuals and biannuals that were harvested of foodstuff before they went to seed, so deposits were less likely to be found. And from the manuscripts, this includes things such as lettuce, cucumbers, and chard. One of the most significant dig sites for plant remains in my study is West Cotton Rounds in Northamptonshire. Here, the plants remains from 5 medieval tenements associated with the manor house were analysed by Jill Campbell and Mark Robinson. Tenement A was built in around 1250 to the south of the manor. You should be able to see it here. Tenement B was a smaller single room with a malt house to the side, so a little bit smaller than tenement A, and built at around the same time. Tenement C was also a single room dwelling, although this one did have a kitchen area, although it was slightly smaller than A's. And tenement D was described as a small cottage, comprised of 4 smaller rooms around a kitchen space. And there's also tenement E included in the study, which, much like tenements C and D, remain relatively small with a smaller kitchen area. For the purpose of the plant remains analysis, tenements C and D were discussed together, so keep that in mind as I discuss their findings. Occurring most frequently at West Cotton Rounds was black medic, with over 500 samples across the sites, which isn't surprising, given black medic is a hardy plant, often referred to as a weed today, considering how far it grows and spreads prolifically. The plant is fibrous and could be cooked in the same manner as spinach, and was used to flavour food in the medieval period. It could be potentially used as an antibiotic and mild laxative, and may well have been used in herbal medicine, although it cannot be identified in any of the manuscripts I have studied. And this, as we mentioned, could be because it is referred to under a different medieval name and the translations have not survived. Given how associated the West Cotton Round site is with domestic life, it's not surprising then that black medic occurred frequently, and it is also possible that when it was originally planted, there was only a small amount of it, but when the site was abandoned and the gardens left to waste, obviously, plants grow out of control. Following this trend, beans were the next most identified category, and they were also used medicinally across the manuscript, as well as being a foodstuff, and mentioned 11 times. And similarly, common medicinal herbs such as chamomile, mallows, plantain and roses were found at all 4 of the sites. Another interesting find was a barrel latrine from Worcestershire, which gives us a bit more of an understanding of how accessible these plants would be to an urban audience, which was discovered when developmental works led to the demolition of houses in Sidbury. Radiocarbon dating on the latrine suggests it was from the late medieval period, with the 3rd layer of deposits being around 40 plus or minus 70 years. It was excavated by James Greig, and unfortunately, the relationships to the latrine to the buildings around it are unclear due to the post-medieval development of the area, which unfortunately damaged much of the surrounding structure and the top half of the latrine, as you can see from the disturbance on the barrel. The plant remains and pollen deposits trapped within the latrine show what was consumed by individuals, as well as what was growing nearby. The local inhabitants in this urban area had access to a wide variety of medicinal plants, including roses and fennel, 2 of those plants that were most frequently mentioned in the manuscripts, as well as henbane seeds, nightshade, and parsley were also identified in quite large amounts in the samples. And these plants also have well-documented medicinal use, although please do not try them at home. Henbane and nightshade in particular can be very poisonous. Henbane was used as a sedative and analgesiac against muscle spasms. And in both British Library Harley 2389 and the Book of Rotter, henbane seeds are used to treat the itching of hands caused by worms. For example, it advises the individual to take and wash their hands clean, then cast on a fair coal fire a good quantity of henbane seed and hold thy hands over the fire, as long as you may suffer it. And then put thy hands in a basin of cold water, and thou shalt see the worms creep out into the cold water. Probatum est. So somebody's done this before and proved it works for the medieval mind. Nightshade also has anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. But like henbane, is highly poisonous. In Sloane 72, nightshade is used to cure rabid dog bites, and was suitable for both human and animal use. Perhaps here it evokes similar ideas of treatment by contrary that underpinned the fascination with treacle in medieval plague cures. For example, the Sloane manuscript advises the reader to take like portion of every one of the herbs following: scabies, waterfallen, nightshade, with the blue flowers of safe lily roots, and seethe them, stamp them, and strain them out. And if you have a soul, still them, and then take the water of them and put it into a little city cow with such liquor as you have near you, and minister it unto no feather, and if it be man or beast, drink it. It must be given, and in 9 days after the misfortune. So you need to take this 9 days after the bite for hope of cure. And parsley itself was also found in the barrel, was often used in a green sauce, a sick room dish that was considered easy to digest and humorally balanced, so to promote healing. And parsley was also a powerful diuretic and said to aid in the reduction of bloating more generally. Archaeobotanical evidence shows how many medieval plants that were grown in gardens or were easy to forage could be used in medicine. And however, while many of the remedies I have looked at could be produced using native British plants alone, this is not always the case in the remedies, and therefore understanding how women's role in provisioning the household from the production of ale to the purchasing of raw materials, spices, and those precious stones that occur for medicinal use must form part of the investigation to conclude how practical these manuscripts would be for medicinal use in a gentry household. However, that forms another story for another time, which I do not have time to go into today. Across this paper then, I hope that I have explored the importance of gardening to women's domestic medical practices in a gentry household. Cultivating a garden enabled the production of medicine, and both were part of medieval women's everyday life. Using archaeobotanical data can also allow us to see beyond the gentry and aristocratic levels of medieval English society that left written reports, to consider how practical many of these recipes would have been to the lower classes and the peasantry, and gives us an understanding of how they might have circulated in an oral culture that is now lost. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating and meticulous detail. And I do hope you'll come back with the next chapter at some stage. I do have one question here, but please, everybody, do put your questions in the chat box. This is a question from Malcolm Thick. Would the gardening advice to husband women in Tusser's 500 Points of Good Husbandry be of use to you?
Potentially, it is on my list of things to look at that I have not got quite round to yet.
Good.
I would have to look through and consider how much of it is a more general husbandry practice and gardening and managing the land, and then how much is gardening in a household sense, as I try and make the distinction in the work between general agriculture and the domestic garden, which grew additional plants and foodstuff, but not the cereal crops to the scale that gentry estates could and did produce. But thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask, what was the most interesting medicinal recipe that you've come across in your so far?
There's been some absolutely great ones. There's some that I guarantee would work, but not for the way that medieval women, the medieval mind would have thought. Of particular note is one that I think is in Sloane 421A, so British Library Sloane 421A, which involves writing a rather long, complicated prayer 3 times on a dock leaf that you then put under the person's pillow. But before they went to sleep on that, you would give them a large glass of red wine that you had boiled poppy seeds in. So it would hopefully make the person sleep, but it could prove some quite nasty consequences.
I love the idea of putting it under the pillow.
Yes.
The tooth fairy might be there too. Right, has anybody else got anything? Are we all overwhelmed with all this information?
Can I come back?
Hello, Malcolm,
Can I come back
please do.
to what I think maybe you may find is a continuity between the late medieval and the early modern period,
Yeah.
which is why I suggested Tusser. There are quite a few cookery and medicine books which survive from the 17th and 18th century and are to be found in gone from my head, the medical library in London.
Thank you. That's helpful. The next section I'm working on is in part of the introduction, and I was aware that there is a lot of kitchen physic manuals published in the early modern period, but it's helpful to see that continuity of gardening also continues. Thank you for that.
Yeah, but there are manuscript recipe books. Are the medieval ones set out in the same way that the early modern ones are, with cookery in the front and medicine in the back?
No, the manuscripts I have looked at have what I refer to as an organic compilation. So everything is very much mixed together. So on the same folio, you might have a medicinal remedy, a gardening tip, some cooking or preservation instructions. And it works like that throughout. It doesn't have any clear structure, and you really get the sense reading them that it is the household and the family writing down whatever is important to them or whatever they learn at that time. So the information is written as it comes to them, as opposed to having any clear set layout in that sense.
Yeah, so they're a commonplace book rather than anything else.
Yes.
I wonder when the structure of dividing 2 types of recipes became common then. It's something I'll have to dig away at.
Yes, it'd be interesting to look at on this end, as I know medicine texts are often structured from head to toe in the university sense. So your academic medical texts from the medieval period would start with treatment for the head and work down to the feet. These collections obviously don't follow that either, but it would be interesting to see when you get a split division occur.
Yeah. It was the Wellcome Library was what I was thinking of.
Thank you.
I have a question here from Michael Ann. Is it possible to assess how likely gentry women during this period would have had access to any written instructions, or are recipes more likely to have been passed on orally?
I think they would have had access to both written and orally. In the upper gentry families, such as the Pastons, who I mentioned at the beginning, there is evidence of them having compilations of medical texts that could be consulted in the household. And these manuscripts on the screen I see very much as working domestic books that could be used and consulted by members of the household. And in some cases, potentially could have been written by women. And women, of course, shared written knowledge in their letter collections. So writing to one another, sharing knowledge and recipes in that sense. And like you mentioned, everything would have also circulated orally, particularly in texts that belong to any gynecological treatises. They often come at the beginning with the translation aim that it's so women that are lettered, so women that could read, could share the knowledge in the text with other women who could not read. So they had the knowledge and didn't have to consult a male physician with their feminine ailments. Of course, we should know, as Monica Green advises, that just because it says this is a translation goal doesn't guarantee a female audience and readership, and men did read these texts. But I think it's highly likely that gentry women who had to be literate for estate management purposes when their husbands were so often away would have had access to written medical information as well as hearing it orally.
Thank you. Is there any evidence of people, of gentry women giving medicines as a sort of gift, as they would have done with special food?
There's evidence of them giving medicines to their friends in times of need. So coming back to the Paston letter collection, there's a lot of evidence from Margaret Paston sharing remedies in her social network to her friends. Slightly later, her second son, John III's wife, provided a recipe for floss and guntorum, so flower of ointments, to the king's attorney, James Hobart.
Gosh.
So they obviously thought that this recipe would work to help his bad knee. So in that sense, you see it as not being given as necessarily a status gift, but sharing knowledge in the times of need. There's a wonderful later reference. The name of the woman escapes me, but she writes to Cardinal Wolsey and essentially gives him the instructions on how to cure sweating sickness in his household, completely unprompted. You get the sense that that advice may not have entirely been welcome, but here she is providing a very detailed cure that she's used.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have a question or a comment that they'd like to make? Because if not, we will close this formal session, and anyone who'd like to stay on and chat informally to Caitlin is very welcome to do so. So if that's it, I will say thank you formally, very much indeed.